and welcome to the Mariah Jean Fit YouTube channel. I'm Coach Mariah. Make sure you like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos as much as possible so we can reach a broader audience. We appreciate your support and enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify. The Fit Minds podcast, Coach Mariah here. So today we're going to talk about hidden calories and probably one of the most overlooked methods for watching your intake and for fat loss is the fact that most people assume that they're eating healthy or that they are not eating that much, but they are probably over consuming their total calories accidentally. So this is where we need to look out for hidden calories, and this entire vlog and podcast is going to be focused on that. So this is probably for those people who haven't tracked macros and calories before, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't eat that much food, I don't feel like I'm gorging myself, I'm still hungry at the end of the day. Or if you feel like that you think you're eating in a calorie deficit, you think you're eating healthy, you think you're dieting, and yet you're still not able to lose body fat. So I'm going to go over obviously what hidden calories are and then examples of those, and then talking about what you can do to monitor hidden calories and start to make a difference in your life just with some small changes and swaps. So first of all, calories that are hidden are the calories that are contained in our foods that we may not realize contain higher calorie amounts. So basically, food items that have lots of energy value in them, but when we look at them, they don't look calorie dense. You look at something small and think that there probably isn't a lot of calories in that. It's only a small portion. And this is where a lot of people can go wrong when it comes to calorie counting or understanding an energy deficit. Dieting is not some sort of weird, magical, wonderful process that occurs when you suddenly start eating healthy and the weight just drops off, or if you have a shake diet, the weight just drops off. It has to do with energy input and output. It's basically maths. No matter which way you look at it, and whether you like it or not, it's basic math of energy value in and energy value out. So obviously that the energy that we are expending for the day, our living, breathing, moving energy, needs to be equated to the amount of calories we're consuming for us to maintain our weight. Otherwise, we are in a deficit, so that's where we are consuming less calories, less energy value than the energy that we are putting out. And that way it forces our body to burn body fat, to use body fat as energy instead of the food that we consume. So that's where we start to see that the calorie deficit incurs fat loss. Obviously, the calorie surplus, so the complete opposite of the calorie deficit, where you are over-consuming total calories and energy value for the day, no matter how small your portions are, you may be over-consuming total calories. That may be putting you in a surplus and causing you to either gain body fat or maintain your current weight if you're not making any sort of significant changes with lifestyle or food choices. So obviously now we understand calorie maintenance, surplus, and deficit, the different terminologies, and I do a few more podcasts on this, but we obviously need to pay attention to that when we are going to talk about calorie intake and hidden calories. So typically we hear the phrase a lot as nutritionists, I don't eat that much. But when we look at the total calorie intake, we can see that a client is eating low volume, okay, so small portions of food, so things that look quite small when you eyeball them to the eye, and high calorie foods that are basically quite dense in calories, but they do not obviously look like large servings. So that would look like things like, a pie, for example. If it's a cheese and bacon pie, it's only a small serving. It might only take up the palm of your hand, but the total calories in that could be maybe double the amount of calories in a large salad, or even triple the amount of calories. So this is where we see that the volume of a food does not necessarily determine the energy value, meaning that you can very easily overconsume your calories even if you are watching your portions and the sizes of the meals and snacks that you're eating. So you can't necessarily go just by size and by eyeballing a meal. You can't go by, guessing amounts, especially when it comes to things like sauces, spreads, alcohol, and liquid calories. So if these clients are saying that they are under eating their calories or that they are not eating that much, They claim that they're not, but they're not maybe tracking their food accurately, or maybe they are just not tracking their food at all, and they assume that the small amount of food that they visibly can see in front of them is less calories. They are assuming that they are in a calorie deficit, or that they're not eating a lot of food. Technically, they're not eating a lot of food in the way of what they can see, but they are eating more calories than what they would believe. So obviously these clients are also usually not eating very nutrient dense foods, so not a lot of fruit or vegetables, and not many plant-based sources of fiber and things like that. So they will usually be eating, yes, small portions of particular meals, but that obviously doesn't include things like fruit and vegetables, which actually take up quite a large amount of room for the amount of calories that they contain. These clients are also probably not consuming lower sugar or lower fat versions of what they are eating. So most of the time, if they assume that they're eating not very much in the way of food, a lot of these food items could be quite calorie dense because they're very high in sugars or very high in fats, or potentially both. So usually they're over-consuming one or the other, or both as a combination, and this is where we can see that people are running into over-consuming their calories by accident, simply due to the fact that they do not understand what's contained in their foods and what's causing them to be so calorie dense. And obviously they are usually very delicious as well. Calories being a unit of measurement, of energy contained in a food, as I mentioned previously. So if we are having that imbalance with our calorie intake, if you look at it though, it really doesn't take much over a period of time to gain body fat. So it's roughly 3,500 calories over our maintenance calorie intake. So we have a maintenance amount of calories that might be the energy that we expend for the day. That is our maintenance. If we overconsume our calories, 3,500 roughly over that amount, depends on each individual person, but that equates to 500 grams of body fat gain. Okay, so if my maintenance calories for the day for my energy expenditure are roughly 2,400 or 2,500 calories, including my exercise, etc., then that means that if I consumed, 6,000 calories in total, I would then gain roughly 500 grams of body fat, give or take, in that time of over-consuming my calories by the 3,500. So that kind of gives us a gauge of, we can't necessarily gain 500 grams in a day unless we really try quite hard to overconsume our calories. And it is possible to do that if you are eating, low volume and not very nutrient dense foods. You can easily consume 5,000 calories in a sitting sometimes as well without even realizing you're doing it, and then still feel hungry later, because these foods that are low volume, low nutrient density, and not very high in protein usually are also not very filling. So that's the interesting thing, is that a lot of these processed foods, etc., they don't really fill you up, and they don't necessarily give you a feeling that you don't need to eat more food. So this is one of the big issues with over-consuming calories, is that you may be over-consuming your calories and still hungry. So it's such a fascinating idea that your body will be much happier with a balanced diet with lots of fruit and veggies and a higher protein intake to help keep you fuller for longer. So these foods that are, have hidden calories, they're foods that look small as a portion but contain the higher calories for their portion size and volume. Okay, so now we understand that the hidden calories are in these probably very tasty foods, and we often misconceive and misinterpret which foods they are. There's all these assumptions about complete food items being completely written off. So people decide that all forms of ice cream are terrible, or all forms of chocolate are terrible, and the like, and they're not actually understanding portions, total calories for those portions, and also the alternatives that we could possibly have for those food items. But the types of foods that we're talking about that have hidden calories, generally you'll be able to tell on the back of the packet, because it will tell you how many calories per serving or per 100 grams. So they are usually foods with higher amounts of added sugars or fats. And the interesting thing is there are literally dozens of different names for sugar. So you could look at the back of a packet and think, this is pretty low in sugar. I can't see sugar in the ingredients. And they may use other names, lots of different names. There's corn syrup is one of them, but there are literally dozens of different types of sugars that exist. And so it might be that they are laced with or very full of different types of sugars. Partially because it's quite good to preserve a food item with sugar, but also because it tastes better with more sugar, as we know that. So obviously being higher in saturated fats as well, fats are very easy to hide in a food in large amounts as well. So this is where you can see that calories can be packed into a very small amount, even like a little nut bar or a little fruit, what we think is a fruit bar, etc. And the more condensed it is, the higher in calories it is. So the more sugar and fat added to that particular food item, the more calorie dense it's going to be for the size. So imagine it this way and envision it this way, because this is changing your ideas of food and portions and sizes and what's contained in them and what's relative to the amount of calories and energy value in them. And it's not all created the same. Not every single food item is created the same. So for example, you'll have a cup of spinach versus a teaspoon of sugar, and that cup of spinach probably only has about 10 calories. A teaspoon of sugar, depending on what type of sugar, can be anywhere from 30 to 40 calories, maybe 20 calories. It really depends. But you're looking at, from a volume perspective, the cup of spinach takes up quite a lot of room, and this teaspoon of sugar obviously only takes up, a 50-cent coin or so. So when you look at that comparison, that is the volume comparison of whole foods versus obviously sugars and fats. And then a major issue is that people are starting to write off, sugars and fats as being awful for you as well. And so people are swinging from one end to the other when it comes to their intake. So I always teach finding balance, but I also want you to understand the relative comparison between different calorie amounts, low volume with a teaspoon of sugar and the high volume with the spinach. So imagine it being like a cup of straight cordial, okay? So you wouldn't drink a cup of straight cordial, it's too sweet. But obviously the amount of calories contained in that straight cordial is going to be quite high, right? Because it's pure cordial, okay? So this is kind of like the more cordial that we add to items, right? So the more cordial you add to your glass of water, the stronger it is. So the more sugar and the more fats that you add to products, or companies will add to products, obviously the more calorie dense it is. So they are very, very concentrated in calories, just like cordial is concentrated in flavor. So obviously the more water you add to your cordial, the more diluted it gets. And so I would use an example like spinach, which is quite water dense. It has lots of fiber, which is what helps with our digestion. And it's quite low in sugar because it doesn't contain a lot of natural sugars, very small amounts of carbohydrates in spinach. So the cordial comparison would be that there's probably more like a teaspoon of cordial in a cup of spinach versus obviously with your teaspoon of sugar. If you did teaspoons and teaspoons of that to fill up the same amount of space as spinach, it's like a pure cup of cordial basically. So I like to make that comparison because people can understand it's not necessarily as clean cut as, talking about calories as numbers, but certainly about the concentration of different types of foods like sugars and fats added to other foods, which will increase their total calories. And this can often make other foods look bad, right? So it can make things like potato look bad because people are covering them in fats. It can make things like carbohydrates like bread and oats and grains look bad because people are covering them in sugar. It can make fruit look bad because people are making juices that have a high level of sugar in them because of the concentration of the amount of sugar and amount of fruit used to make that juice. So this is where liquid calories come in, and obviously the other example of extra calories that are hidden would be alcohol. So it can be often found in fatty foods, high sugar foods, or liquid beverages higher in fats / sugars and total calories as a result, due to being more condensed in sugar, fats, and even some added alcohol to drinks as well. So it's really important to understand that when you look at a cup, versus another cup, a cup of something versus another cup, and you don't know the ingredients in it, you would have to pay caution to the idea that there could be any amount of calories in that cup, whether it's the same size as another cup or not. So you could have a cup that's a long black, for example, a long black coffee. There's no added sugar to that. It's literally just a shot of coffee. There's no milk, so there's no calories from the milk. And so you're probably looking at between 10 and 15 calories for that long black. If you were to get the equivalent size cup, let's say of a Starbucks coffee, it might be, a frappe with caramel syrup, and it might have cream and then full cream milk as well. And then you're looking at obviously every food item that you add that has more sugar and fats in it, that drink could then be around anywhere from 600 to 1,000 calories. So you can see the comparison size-wise, not very different and very similar in size, but the actual amount of calories contained in both are extremely different. In fact, they differ so much that that can be something that can throw out your entire day's worth of calories and put you into a calorie surplus. Crazy. So the hidden calories in foods, and those particular types of food items that contain really high calories for what they look like, are generally not very satiating foods. And what we mean by that is it obviously doesn't fill you up very much, as I mentioned earlier. So this is because of being low in fiber. So fiber helps fill you up. Also, usually these foods are generally lower in nutrients. So you're not going to have a lot of your essential nutrients like vitamin B. You're not going to have a lot of things like niacin. You're not going to have any sort of iron, not in large amounts generally with these very calorie dense foods, because they are taken up by fats and sugars, which don't generally come with a lot of benefits. Outside of fruit, fructose, that type of sugar in fruit, you do get vitamins and minerals that come in fruit as well, and obviously the fiber, which helps with your digestion. So, but when we're looking at things like biscuits and deep fried foods, etc., generally it looks like that the calories are going to be taken up by the fats and sugars that are added, and they're not going to come with a lot of nutrients for the calories that they provide. So they're usually not very dense in water either, okay? So they don't generally contain water like fruit and vegetables do, and obviously that helps fill you up a little bit more as well. And as I mentioned, they're not very high in protein generally. So you can still obviously have high protein foods that are high in calories. A good example would be a crumbed steak, which is a fattier cut. It's obviously going to come with protein, but it's also going to come with the fats from that steak, and then also the crumbs, which may contain added oils, and then even the added crumbs, which is even more calories on top of that. So this is where you can start to really tick over in your mind about the meals you might have been eating that may have had additional calories that you may not have thought about. So examples of foods or beverages with higher added sugars would be things like fruit juices, which we often think and assume are healthy, which is why we talk about, instead of assuming that something is healthy, we need to actually talk about the amount of calories contained in that, the energy value. Yes, that it might have some nutrients in it. Yes, it may be labeled as healthy, but we have to look at the serving sizes, the calories and the kilojoules on the back relative to what we are meant to be consuming for the day. So fruit juices, soft drinks, full sugar soft drinks are the ones that are in the spotlight here, because full sugar soft drinks are more calorie dense. They don't fill you up, okay? They process very quickly. They are almost like a quick release carbohydrate, and they're not very good for tooth decay, as we do know. So along with that though, there are alternatives to these options which you can choose, and I'll go through those a bit later. So things like milky drinks can contain more sugar than you realize, like extra syrups. Things like smoothies, okay? So people often assume smoothies are healthy. They'll go out, they'll grab a fruit smoothie, not realizing that the person may have put 5 bananas, a mango, and half a pineapple into a smoothie. Yes, you can fit that all into one beautiful dense cup. The more you blend your food, obviously the more condensed it gets. And so this is where you can see that your smoothies can literally be up to a couple of thousand calories literally in one giant cup. And you assume that that is super healthy, but it is absorbed very quickly, because you can imagine that the blender has done the chewing for you. So coffees or teas with added sugars, creams, or syrups. This is a really big one, and probably very common because everybody loves to order their takeaway coffee. So I think that the assumption is that with coffee, is, it's got some fat burning properties, sure, but if you're adding a ton of cream and sugar and syrups and ice cream into that, and obviously full cream milk, you're starting to see a lot of added sugars. And people don't realize, but dairy is a good option to obviously provide some sort of calcium for the diet, but generally you're going to look at things like low fat dairy options, because lactose is contained obviously in milk. And with lactose, it is a sugar, so it's processed as a sugar, a different type of sugar, but definitely a sugar in the body. So ice creams is another option. Another example. Ice creams can be quite high in both sugars and fats, and generally you're going to see that there's a huge variety of different ice creams and the amount of calories contained in those depending on their ingredients. So at one end of the scale, you might have something like a Blue Ribbon, low calorie ice cream, which is, for those who don't really understand the different calories and portions, it would be 365 calories for the whole tub, so that's kind of like a couple of mouthfuls of Ben & Jerry's ice cream equivalent. But why? It doesn't taste terrible when you eat it. Why is that? They use artificial and alternative sweeteners in those ice creams, in the lower fat, lower sugar ice creams. They actually take some of the fat out of the, they're not using, for example, added creams and things, so they actually reduce the fat content and the sugar content, and it doesn't taste too dissimilar. You'll actually find if you start to eat the lower fat, lower sugar ice cream, over time, if you went back to Ben & Jerry's, it would be very sickening. So major reason though Ben & Jerry's is actually quite high in calories is because if you look on the back of a Ben & Jerry's tub, and I really have a distaste of Ben & Jerry's, and the major reason is because their first ingredient is sugar. Now, I'm not against sugar. I'm certainly not a nutritionist who says it's the devil, but I think that having products that are very high in sugar is almost like a bit of a misleading type of behavior on behalf of companies who could reduce their sugar content just slightly and still have the same effect with flavor. And it's seeing people overconsume their calories quite easily when there are other options out there, and they could eat a whole tub of ice cream for the same as a couple of mouthfuls and not put their health at risk as well. So other examples would be things like chocolates and cakes. So we know I do love chocolate, I do like cake, but obviously if you have things like added creams and you have, a very sugar dense cake where someone's added literally 6 cups of sugar, the cake, the size of the cake, the portion of the cake could look exactly the same, but contain twice as many calories of another piece of cake, literally just because of things like cream, added dried fruit. It could be added sugars, added liquid sugar, added butter, etc., etc. And obviously, the more dense the fat in that cake or the chocolates, etc. So if you're having a chocolate that is, very high in sugar and the first ingredient is sugar, which most chocolate is, if you're going to eat a whole block of that, you'll actually find that that will be quite high in calories, just literally due to the fact that it contains a high level of sugar and fats. Baked foods such as cakes and slices, as I mentioned, but also things like croissants, lots of baking and things that you would get from a fresh bakery that taste really yummy, but will have things like added oils and added sugars to them as well. So there's a reason why they taste so good, and the reason why the companies keep putting sugar and fat in them in larger amounts is a combination of preservation. They're cheap ingredients to fill a food item out with, and also it makes it taste better. Deep fried foods such as crumbed, battered fish, etc. And obviously that includes things like chicken schnitzels. You'll have a perfectly good chicken breast covered in crumbs and then deep fried. So this is where you can see that there'll be just as many calories in the crumbs and the oil as there is in the chicken breast. It's quite frightening where all these added calories are coming from. And there is sugar added to packaged items such as biscuits, bars, all sorts of bars. Even some muesli bars that we think are fantastic will have added sugar to a certain extent, and the calorie intake of those can vary greatly depending on the brand. And this is what we need to look at, is that it's not that these food items are awful, but certainly some brands are going to be, I'd say, worse than others for higher calorie or hidden calorie amounts, just depending on even things like the cost of their budget and what they look at adding into products and their values, their company values as well. So there's sugar added to things like sushi rice. A lot of people don't realize this, but when you go out and you eat sushi, there's actually a sugar added to the rice. So this is where you can see sushi, which you would usually, if you made at home, have a little bit more of a reasonable calorie version of it, that the sugar added to that rice can add extra calories where you didn't even realize they were going, and that actually helps keep the rice sticking together. Condiments such as chocolate, sauce, toppings, and syrups. So obviously the liquid version of sugar, again, it's literally just liquid sugar in a topping, and we can add some fats to that as well, and all of a sudden it becomes very calorie dense. Examples of foods with higher added fats would be things like ice creams, chocolates, cakes, and baked goods. See how these seem to overlap with some of the sugary foods as well? It's because, honestly, sometimes they contain higher amounts of both. Deep fried foods such as crumbed or battered foods, again, you can find that the amount of sugar that's added to sometimes crumbs and dressings and all sorts of random things, you'll find that sometimes it might be like a deep fried or battered banana, and the batter itself has sugar added to it. So when I mentioned battered things before, funnily enough, sometimes crumbs actually have sugar added. Batter has sugar added to give it a little bit of a twang. Not often, but even things like cream, flour, and butter, they'll add to batters. So you can have this crossover in some instances where baked and battered goods, whether deep fried or not, can have added sugar. So yes, they obviously will contain extra fats, because if they're deep fried, once they've got the batter on them or they're crumbed, they're actually then put into a deep fryer, which is oil. The oil is not 0 calorie, it has calories in it, it contains an energy value. And if you can imagine, that oil is literally like pure fat, right? So if there's anything that's going to probably be very similar to your own body fat, is going to be that oil. It's very, very dense. So same with the sugar, a tablespoon of fat, whether it be oils or some sort of, butter or something like that, is going to be very dense in calories. It's going to have a lot of energy value in that tiny tablespoon. So some other examples would be things like added butter to bread at cafes. This is quite common, where you'll see, eggs on toast served with butter on the bread, and you have to actually request for them not to do that. And that could literally add an extra 300 calories to your meal just for having butter. So you can actually have more calories in the butter than in the bread, which is astonishing, considering obviously butter, you think, doesn't take up much room. Takeaway foods, and this is where we see obviously the contribution to the obesity epidemic in Western countries. Things like KFC, McDonald's, Chinese, restaurants, cafe foods, etc. And anything with things like added cheeses and sauces and things that just taste absolutely delicious and they're covered in oil. This is where you're going to see that there is a contribution to the total amount of calories, a much higher amount of calories, simply because they have those added sugars and added fats and added oils to the extra ingredients that make it taste yummy. So in Chinese as well, they'll add oils and things because that will make it more calorie dense, and obviously more tasty. So the crumbs that are added to meats, as I mentioned, with a chicken Kiev, even sushi meat, so people often look past this, but you would see those little bits of chicken that are in sushi will have the added crumbs. Sauces such as eggs Benedict or Kewpie mayo. So this one's really common, but basically people assume that sauces, because there's not much of it, they're not using much, that doesn't contain very many calories. But you can find that some sauces will literally have, even for a small serving, the eggs Benedict, for example, can literally be between 200 and 400 calories, depending on how much sauce they decide to pour on your meal. It's absolutely crazy. Now, to give that a kind of perspective, you'd be looking at anywhere from 2 to 4 bananas. So that amount of room that it takes up, and you'd have to literally eat, dozens and dozens of cups of spinach just to make up for the calories, or to equate to the calories that are contained in eggs Benedict sauce. So other examples of added fats and hidden calories from added fats would be things like crisps, chips, and biscuits, because when they add those oils, often saturated fats and binders and things, that's where you'll see that they basically put in the foods. You don't taste them directly. It's not like you can taste the butter, but certainly it's in there, and it will increase the total calorie amount of that food item. Cheeses, fatty cuts of meat. Cheeses is a big one people look past, but cheese is very dense in calories because it obviously has added fats and sometimes added sugar, depending on what process they use for the cheese, and if they do put fruits in the cheeses, for example. Fatty cuts of meat such as lamb or fatty beef or bacon. So again, these fats are very dense in calories. When they are also turned into liquids as well, they're very dense in calories. But if you have a combination of this plus the protein, often people can assume they're eating healthily, but they don't realize that the fatty cut can actually increase the calories and basically double the amount of calories that would be in a meat item equivalent of the same weight of a leaner cut. So added oils or butter to vegetables, either roasted or steamed. So people will often, spray their veggies in olive oil. They'll bake things in oil, or they will add oil on top of salads, etc., not really being aware of the amount of calories contained in those oils that they add. So egg yolks. Obviously eggs aren't terrible, they're not the devil, and I don't want anyone to think that, but if you're eating say 10 eggs a day, or 8 eggs, or 6 eggs, or 4 eggs for breakfast, you can very easily blow your fats out for the day because there are fats in egg yolks. So this is where people say, look, 2 eggs a day, I think if you're on higher calories, you can obviously eat more eggs, but if you're looking at total fat intake, one way to keep that down is literally just to have the 2 eggs and add egg whites to it, because the egg whites are pure protein. It's the egg yolk that contains fats. And so this is where you can see that people think that they're eating really healthily because they're eating a ton of eggs, but then you can look at over consuming fats and total calories as a result. Avocado and nuts. So these are more of the, where people assume the healthier end. So nut butters and spreads and things like that, people eating whole avocados and thinking they're being super healthy, but there is quite a lot of calories, close to 300 calories in a whole avocado. That's literally the same as an entire, voluminous meal. If you are, trying to be in a calorie deficit, you could actually have a meal for 300 to 350 calories if you focused on the portions of the different macronutrients in it. And it's crazy to think, but you could literally have half a cup of rice for around 100 calories. So the relative amount of volume, and that's a carbohydrate that's quite dense in calories too. So potato, I'll use an example. You could probably have 1.5 to 2 cups of potato, of the equivalent of a whole avocado, and it doesn't really take up much room when you actually lay it out. So the volume of potato versus avocado calories is very different. And funnily enough, potato is a carbohydrate. So this is where we start to break down the walls of this idea that, carbs are the devil, as I mentioned in previous podcasts, and sugar is the devil. It's because it's not. It's actually when we look at these concentrated added fats and assumption that fats are amazing for you. Yes, they are, but obviously we need to portion them just like anything else. And if anything, we need to focus on the portions of those probably the most. And obviously nuts. So some people saying they're having a handful of nuts as a snack, but their handful of nuts may equate to 100 grams of nuts, and the recommended might be 25 to 30 grams. So they can go from being, say, 80 calories to say even up to say 300 calories, 400 calories. Really, it just depends on how big the handful is. And obviously nut butters and spreads. So it's very easy to overspread something like peanut butter or Nutella because it's delicious. But if you were looking at a 20 gram serving, it's about 100, 110 calories for that. If you put 40 grams on a piece of toast, you can barely tell the difference between 20 grams and 40 grams on 2 different pieces of toast, but you've doubled your calories. So you've got 110 calories of peanut butter on this one, and you've got 220 calories of peanut butter on this one. So you can see how easily it can add up. If you were to look at slices of toast, 2 slices of toast can vary from anywhere between 110 calories for 2 slices and up to maybe 250 calories for 2 slices, depending on the thickness of the cut and the ingredients of the bread. But even that in itself, even the highest calorie bread item, is going to look like a lot bigger of a serving in comparison to 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. Examples of alcoholic beverages. Now, a lot of people don't want to hear this because everybody loves to have a drink, and I totally honestly support balance. I think in prior years as a coach, I was always a big believer in reducing alcohol intake as much as possible. Certainly if you have a problem, like honestly, if you've got a problem consuming alcohol, it's a regular occurrence. It's not even from a calorie perspective, but from a general health perspective, just reducing your total intake and being aware and accountable for that. But obviously all alcohol contains calories. Like yes, even the spirits, even the wines contain calories. There is no such thing as a 0-calorie alcohol. So there's this assumption that alcohol is, because it's empty calories, people think that it just contains nothing and that you can just drink your little heart out. Some people will wake up after a big night of drinking and say they look leaner and, I'm leaner after drinking, like it must be really good for me, or, something magical happens. But alcohol is a diuretic, so it dehydrates you. So you're not leaner, you're literally dehydrated. You have less water in your body. The calories still count for alcohol. They still count. It's something like 65 to 70 calories for a shot of vodka. And it really depends on the different alcohols, but it can be up to 90 calories for a shot of some spirits, depending on how much sugar has been added. And that's just the alcohol. If you look at added mixes, that adds obviously more calories on top if you're having full sugar mixes. So that would be things like if you're having a rum and Coke, you're going to have to account for the calories in the rum shot itself and then the Coke as well. And then obviously if you're eating on top of that, you're then going to see that it's very easy to overconsume the calories. Alcohol is a liquid, calorie. So the way it's processed in the body as well, it doesn't contain any sort of essential nutrients. In fact, alcohol is not considered a part of the nutrient recommendations for any country because there's nothing in alcohol that we need as human beings to survive. Whereas obviously there is in fruit and vegetables, which is funny because there's so many more Australians who'd be willing to, have a beer before they would obviously be willing to eat some broccoli. But if you look at this from a perspective of longevity of health and obviously for fat loss and muscle gain purposes, if you really want to take control of your 2023, if you look at really holding yourself accountable for your alcohol consumption and, understanding things like cocktails, dessert cocktails, full sugar soft drinks, and multiple alcohol shot drinks. So like a Long Island iced tea is going to be awful because it contains multiple shots of alcohol in one drink, more calories. High sugar alcoholic beverages or wines and high carb beers. Okay, so it's a really diverse list, but it pretty much covers most types of alcohol. And you will see there are lower alcohol options out there lower calorie alcohol options out there on the market at the moment. It is a very responsible way to drink, in a sense that they're usually lower in alcohol content as well. But you're seeing that there is not that extra calorie dose from the added sugar from the soft drinks. And also if you're not drinking cocktails, if you're having low sugar soft drinks or no sugar soft drinks with your alcohol, you'll find that you'll obviously consume less calories. And even just having a glass of water for each glass of alcohol you're having, no, it's not going to make you sober up more. It's actually going to help hydrate you. And if anything, you should be doing that to try and pace yourself as well. So obviously, given that, now that I've slammed what has additional calories, you're probably thinking, oh my God, I can't step a foot outside of what I'm doing currently, or now I need to completely tidy up my diet and rethink absolutely everything I do with regards to portions and amounts. But I'm going to give you some basic tips on how to be more aware of hidden calories, okay, and how to start actioning this and how to make this sustainable so that you're not missing out on the foods that you enjoy. Because I don't miss out on chocolate, I don't miss out on special events, and I'm not some sort of genetic anomaly. I just am very smart and aware of calorie intake. So examples of smart swaps will be things like low sugar or low fat dressings or sauces or condiments. There are literally so many of them on the market these days, and probably more now than ever in awareness of this. So keep an eye out for those. Low sugar or low fat ice creams, they get a really bad rap, but they are a great option so that you can obviously have a little bit more, and they don't taste too dissimilar once you get used to them. They don't taste awful. I've been eating lower sugar and lower fat ice cream for years now. The only downside to low sugar items is that sometimes it can cause some digestional upset, so you just don't want to have too much of them basically, because it will be differing from person to person as to how much you can tolerate. There are low fat cheeses, so there's low fat cream cheese, there's low fat feta, there are low fat standard grated cheeses as well. There are lots of options for low fat cheeses. Cottage cheese and ricotta cheese are great options too. High protein options, okay, so this is where you can swap out things that may be lower protein for higher protein because it's going to fill you up a little bit more. But check the back of the packet to make sure it's actually higher in protein, because often they'll advertise this and there's no sort of policing around this just yet. So anywhere from, I would consider from 10 to 50 grams for a portion or a meal. It might be a packaged meal if it says high protein and it's only 15 grams of protein for that meal. It's not high in protein. But if you've got a muesli bar, for example, that has about 10 grams or 15 grams of protein, it's pretty high in protein. If it says it's high protein, it has 5 grams of protein, put it down. Don't buy it. 5 grams of protein is literally that in peanut butter. It's very deceiving when they put that on the label. But hopefully in years to come, there'll be something around that with the FDA and being able to advertise that. So lower fat cuts of meat, so obviously things like leaner mince, chicken breast, not having skin on your meats as well, because this can save the fats, the additional fats. And obviously no duck, no lamb. These are very fatty meats, or at least less frequently. Breads and baked goods that are not dense in sugars or fats or total calories. So just check the nutrition panel. Sometimes you can literally get a bread that has 2 slices that's going to have half the amount of calories for the same, 2 slices of a loaf of bread. So it is really important to check the labels. This is literally a part of my recommendations. And it's not that hard. Pick up an item at the grocery store and flip it around. Just be aware. Once you've figured that out and you've found what works, and there are plenty of recommendations on the internet, you can literally look up, hashtag calorie swap, smart calorie swaps, and it will open up a plethora of a world of foods that you can eat instead of the ones that you are currently that have less calories in them. Making foods at home as much as possible. If you do so, you know exactly what's going into the foods that you make, okay? So you'll have a better awareness of what's contained in your meals and your snacks if you are literally, making them at home. Make your meals at home and you know what goes in them. If you're eating out a lot, not only are you spending a ridiculous amount of money on things that you could make at home, you also just don't know what that person is putting in that meal, unless the restaurant has its calories on MyFitnessPal, and there are not many of them that do. But you can check out if they do before you go. Places like Grilled are really good. Subway, McDonald's does have their food items in MyFitnessPal, but obviously the overconsumption of saturated fats from food items from McDonald's is the major concern. And that's obviously another thing to mention, is that in fat intake, it's not just the total fat intake that we're worried about and the higher calories, but also the total saturated fat intake The recommended amount is 10% of your total daily intake daily. You don't want to go over that. So basically of your 30% fats, or between the 20 and 30% fat intake, depending on your exercise levels, you really want to have just 10% of your total intake. So it's only a third of your fat intake that can really be taken up by saturated fats, and that's due to the risk of chronic heart disease they've found is associated with higher consumption of saturated fats. Very easy to do if you're eating a lot of processed foods. So reduce added sugar added to coffees and consumption of sugar-dense drinks such as juices, takeaway smoothies, etc. So liquid calories are probably the major culprit, I think, and definitely in studies is the major culprit in America currently, is the increase in consumption of sugary soft drinks, in that most people are assuming that they can just drink them and nothing happens, but obviously it contains sugar. The sugar-free alternatives are going to be a fantastic option for those soft drinks. Not only will that reduce tooth decay, but also reduce total calorie consumption. And this is where you can make a big difference. Not necessarily assuming that a glass of juice or a bottle of juice is going to be the healthy option just because it is juice. You could probably liken it to soft drink. It's going to have similar properties in the way of the amount of sugar contained sometimes. Not as bad for tooth decay, but certainly can still have an effect because of the high concentration of just a different type of sugar, being fructose. So obviously reducing the added sugar to your coffees, it literally may look like you may have 6 sugars added to your coffee currently, which is blowing out your total calorie intake a little bit. You could reduce that over time. I used to be a 3 to 4 sugar girl back in the day, and now I have no sugar in my coffee, and the milk is literally enough for me now. So your body gets used to it. Your taste buds get used to it. Moderate your alcohol consumption, as I mentioned earlier. Choosing sugar-free soft drinks to mix with your spirits or lower calorie or carb options. So even low-carb beers, etc. There are quite a few out there now. Do the comparison though. Have a look, see whether or not there's much of a difference between calories per serve. And if there isn't, then maybe the option that you were going to go for wasn't so bad. Things like sparkling wine, sparkling plain wine, white wines, non-sweetened wines, dry wines are actually going to be pretty good options. They're going to have a very similar calorie equivalent per serving as what you're going to get from a shot of alcohol. Choose a drink with a single shot instead of numerous shots of alcohol, okay, because obviously you're going to drink the other one faster, the multiple shots. But if you're trying to watch your calorie intake and you're trying to lose body fat but you still want to drink, maybe don't go for the Long Island iced tea. Go easy on the sauce, or ask for sauce on the side, or even try to have no sauce if you can, if you want to, try that on for size. I don't often have sauce now, and if I do, I'll have a little bit and just obviously put the rest to the side. I don't need to have something completely covered in sauce because obviously, as I mentioned, sauces can be quite dense in calories. Read your labels, calories per 100 grams for comparisons, and look at the sugars and fats per serving, okay? So really have a look at what's contained per 100 grams with regards to calorie servings. You don't necessarily want to just pick something up and go, yep, that looks good. Like, have a look at how many calories per serving there are. And if the biscuits are incredibly high in calories and you think, oh my God, there's 600 calories per serving and the biscuit's only this big, maybe you might go for an option that is a little bit less calorie dense. And the per 100 grams is really good because I think that one I use for things that I'm portioning out. And so I go, okay, cool, these chips are a little bit lower in calories per 100 gram, and maybe it's because they're lower in fats, maybe they're baked, not fried. Try to steer clear from saturated fats, as I mentioned, where you can. Obviously this is for a health reason, but certainly the saturated fats can also increase the calories in a food item, so just keep an eye out for that. If you turn a packet around, it will actually tell you, it has to tell you legally how much of the recommended daily intake of saturated fats it contains, and obviously how many saturated fats in grams. So go easy on fats on that note. No need to eat a whole avocado or unlimited amounts of nuts. If I see another person telling me they're going on a keto diet and they start eating handfuls of nuts and whole avocados and pouring olive oil all over things like there's no tomorrow, it's going out of fashion, I'm probably going to flip my shit. And the reason why I get so worked up about keto is because obviously now we understand that it's a high fat diet, and the overconsumption of fats can see that your calorie intake increases quite a lot, Any sort of initial weight loss that keto dieters would have seen would have come from the fact that they cut carbohydrates, and excess carbohydrates are stored as glycogen under the muscle. So it can be anywhere from literally 500 grams to up to 2 kilos of carbohydrate and water that we can store at once. And this is actually our natural body's storage system for energy to use for later. So carbohydrates have their own ability to be used for later as from glycogen under the muscle. And so when people went keto, cutting those carbs, they saw the glycogen drop. They thought it was fat loss, or they assume that it's fat loss, and then as a result of continuing keto onwards, they're actually increasing their fat intake and potentially accidentally over-consuming their calories because they are literally trying to eat nothing but, fats and protein. And obviously, the next point would be keeping an eye out for added oils to what might have a more natural version, such as nuts. So roasted nuts can have added oils. Just try and get the natural nut version. So instead of having mixed nuts that are roasted, just go for the unroasted version where you won't have those added oils. Focus on portion control with fattier or higher sugar spreads. So don't lather it on really thick, just kind of estimating. Maybe try and work with a tablespoon, or maybe try and work with a thin layer or a thinner layer. Or just potentially measuring a spread. There's nothing stopping you from putting your plate on a food scale and measuring out the total amount and understanding the calories in that, so that you know that you're not going overboard with it. Go easy on the peanut butter, the jam, the honey, etc. If you keep, adding these sauces and these spreads and these liquid calories and these very fat and sugar-dense calories in larger amounts on literally everything you eat, you are going to see the overconsumption of calories is rather easy. Portion control with literally anything from a packet, including cereals, etc. So looking at if it comes out of a packet, understand the serving size, understand the portion control, understand that it's not just estimating a bowl. You really have to have a better idea of how much you're eating to know how many calories are in it before obviously proceeding with repeating that portion size. Try not to double up with fats. So for example, if you have a meal, try not to have avocado, butter and cheese in one meal. Like, it's just a really simple, easy fix. Pick one of them so that then you've got one source of fats for that meal, and obviously change it up from meal to meal. So if you do have triple fats in a meal, it's very quickly going to see those fats increase, and that would include things like oils that you cook your meat in, etc. Drink more water, especially when eating calorie-dense foods, as they are not usually very filling or high in protein. This is a rule of thumb anyway, just drink more water, because obviously it's better for your hydration, energy levels and hunger cravings. But if you are eating these foods that are not very satiating and they're quite calorie dense, if you do drink a bit more water, it's not going to make you burn through it faster. It's not going to make the absorption process slower or anything like that, but it's certainly going to help you feel a little bit fuller, and not feel like you're having to eat more and more of that food item that isn't very filling. Hit your daily recommended protein intake to help fill you up, okay? So there's a reason why we want our clients, and we have a protein intake for you, and we want you to hit that intake, is because it's not, some sort of magical, wonderful thing that we just want you to do because. It's because it actually helps keep you fuller for longer, and it does help stop you from snacking on things in between meals that probably are going to increase your calories quite easily. So if you do hit your protein intake, you'll find that you won't feel as hungry as often, and that's actually a very good thing. Monitor your total daily calories and try to keep your fats under 30% of your total daily intake as per the National Dietary Guidelines, and this is pretty much very similar to most countries' guidelines around the world. They're a little bit different, but pretty much the same in what they support. So to conclude the vlog and podcast, sugar is not the devil, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, which you can listen to if you're curious about that one. Neither are carbohydrates. It doesn't necessarily mean that fats are the devil either. It's just being mindful and aware and understanding portions and what they contain, and the different amounts of things, and certainly understanding, I suppose, as well, packaged goods, how deceiving they can be, comparing one to another, being just as I suppose scrutinizing of these types of things as you would be with any other important decision in your life, because it does make a difference over time and it all adds up. So it's okay to go over your sugar slightly, and more so for athletes, but obviously, and those who train regularly, but it's just a guideline which may remind people that they're not wanting to go over that because they're not eating very satisfying foods. So often if you're going over your sugar intake a lot, and let's say you're not a person who trains super often, or you're not an athlete or anything like that, you're not needing the carbohydrates for really intense sessions, etc., You may find that it's partially why you're hungry all the time is because you're eating, high sugar foods. You might be going over your total sugar intake, and because you're doing this, this is where you're going to see more of your hunger levels increasing because you're trying to fill yourself up with something that's just not very filling. So obviously this sugar recommendation is kind of a reminder that you may not be eating enough whole foods. So a lot of your fruit and veggies, which most people, honestly, there's like less than 7% of Aussies are eating, I think, more than one piece of fruit a day or something like that. So, or even one piece of fruit a day. It's pretty crazy. And so this sugar recommendation kind of reminds you, okay, you know what, if you're going over that, then maybe you need to swap some of these sugary items for some more whole foods like fruit and vegetables. Another one I would recommend is, instead of drinking fruit juice, instead of assuming smoothies are the best and it's concentrated fruit juice and concentrated fructose and jam it all in together, just eat your fruit, okay? You don't need to blend it, you can eat it. So eat your apple, eat your banana, if you wouldn't, and I love this saying because I've used this for years, but if you wouldn't eat it in one sitting, why would you put it in a blender? If you would not sit down and eat it, don't put it in a blender, don't drink it. So just eat your fruit, stop drinking it. Portion on a plate, not protein, but also protein on a plate is a part of this. Portion on a plate guide would be the thing that I would finish up with. And certainly if you're looking at, okay, do you know what, I don't want to track calories, I just want to understand portions and understand what is in, what calories might be in things, maybe they're more calorie dense. If you look at the portion on a plate, there's usually a guideline for every single country. If you're watching this overseas, you will have one in your own country, but the name differs a little bit. But in Australia, I think it's day on a plate or something like that. The name generally changes every few years, but it's on the National Dietary Guidelines and Standards. There is a website for it, and you can actually have a look at the day on a plate. And that will show you, portions. It will show you recommendations for things that you should probably eat in moderation and smaller amounts of, etc. Less saturated fats, also things like alcohol, and the recommendations for different whole foods. It's not going to give you your exact calorie intake for your individual requirements, but it's going to help you understand that if you're eating those foods in those amounts, it's going to help make you feel fuller for longer and sustain things like your general health. But also on top of that, it's going to help you not overconsume your calories, because a lot of the things they're telling you to eat in moderation are going to be quite high in calories for the portions that they come with. Okay. So that's about it from me. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about hidden calories and the concept behind energy value and intake and output and intake, so calorie output and calorie intake. It can get really complicated in this industry when there's lots of bits of information being thrown at you all the time, and certainly people trying to sell you products all the time and get you on shake diets and get you started with all sorts of crazy things that don't seem to work very often. But it's important for you to know and understand the reason why we need to be more mindful about our intake, because this is a long-term method that actually works really well. I've been using it myself for 10 years and I've not gone wrong with it, but it's not just that. As a nutritionist, as a dietitian, as a health professional, we all specialize in this area. This is what we know, this is what we operate, and this is what we deal with every single day. Sometimes if you see fad diets on the internet, or certainly if you're looking at cutting food groups out, like we've mentioned in previous podcasts, it's generally going to come from somebody who just isn't qualified. And so it's so important to know that the person you're listening to, the person you're taking information from, is qualified, but also to not get wrapped up and tied up in confusing information and really complex methods. Sometimes it's these small changes that will make a big difference in the long run, and even the changes I've given you today could help you lose 5 to 10 kilos just by swapping some things around and being really consistent with that over time. Okay, that's it from me. Looking forward to doing another vlog for you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.